Today's presentation will be about securing Canada in a time of growing global insecurity. Stronger Together, a national security strategy, or in French, Plus fort ensemble, une stratégie de sécurité nationale. The agenda of today's presentation will be defining the problem that Canada is facing. We will then discuss three threats to Canada's national security. Each threat will be described in depth and will present solutions and alternatives that will improve Canada's security strategy. Then we'll finish with the next steps that the government can make in implementing these policy recommendations. Next slide, please. The policy problem is that Canada has an outdated national security strategy that leaves the country unprepared to adequately address the growing threats against its economic stability, public safety, and democracy. Next slide, please. These are the three core priorities. First one, disinformation, polarization, and the erosion of democratic resilience. This can lead to radicalization on a mass scale and increased mistrust in government institutions. One example of the dangers misinformation poses to national security was the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. The next priority will be mercantilism and economic security. How over-reliance on one entity when it comes to trade could decrease Canada's economic independence. And the last core priority is Arctic security and sovereignty. World powers are making advancements in military technologies to traverse deep water environments. It is important for Canada to secure the northern region by having a military presence in the Arctic and by upgrading defense equipment. Our solutions comprehensively address national security at an individual, national, and global level. Next slide, please. Disinformation breeds polarization, which can lead to the erosion of democratic resilience. Disinformation, if left unchecked, can sometimes lead individuals to commit acts of violence. There are many examples in history that show how disinformation can manipulate the masses to the point where entire ethnic groups become even more at risk of receiving violence. The discrimination of Indigenous communities in Canada or the Quebec mosque shooting are just a few local examples of how disinformation can lead to polarizing behavior. When acts of violence occur on Canadian soil, this can greatly erode the sense of security among residents living in this country. Social media is embedded in the daily lives of most Canadians. Cell phones are one of the most utilized digital devices by residents and are the primary tool to access social media. Whether someone watches short video reels or read posts by influencers and friends, cell phones play a big role every day in the lives of Canadians and residents. With social media companies implementing algorithms that get consumers hooked on to their apps, social media plays a great role in spreading disinformation as it can reinforce false and negative ideologies. And with the advent of artificial intelligence, AI can spread false narratives at a mass scale and can quickly cause disunity by misinforming large populations. Disinformation plays a great role in negatively impacting social cohesion, and a divided Canada makes this country much more vulnerable. Now, there are ways to address this complex issue. Next, my amazing colleague Emma will be explaining some solutions to address this threat. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Rashad. The EPA strategy addresses national security at an individual level by tackling disinformation. The first solution is to create a national digital literacy program to help educate young Canadians in identifying disinformation. Researchers often recommend early, in-class digital literacy education as a way to fight online disinformation and radicalization. Creating an educational program can help individuals from an early age decipher fact from fiction. We propose creating a collaborative task force that brings together representatives from all provincial and territorial education ministries, the Federal Ministry of Artificial Intelligence and Digital Innovation, and local organizations with expertise in digital literacy. The task force would be chaired by the Ministry of Canadian Identity and Culture. This task force will be responsible for working with government entities and local organizations to create a curriculum that will eventually become integrated in every province and territory's education system. Recognizing that education is a provincial jurisdiction, the federal government will primarily act as an institution to oversee this national project and will intervene mainly when the provinces ask for assistance. Once the curriculum has been developed, the goal is to run the project in at least one city per province and territory for an entire school year, after which data will be collected to refine the curriculum and then fully implement the program. The cost to design and implement the pilot project would be a total of $6 to $8 million, with funding dispersed by provincial/territorial population size, and the majority of the expenses will be incurred during the development stage. The second solution is to create a Canada Digital Services Act that requires social media platforms to watermark AI-generated content and flag content that has not been fact-checked by the platform. This solution will be time-consuming and expensive as it requires legislation. However, the benefits outweigh the cost. Although it is difficult to regulate social media, this act would make it easier to identify misleading content, therefore helping mitigate the spread of disinformation at a mass scale and achieve the goal of making online disinformation more obvious to Canadians. The third solution is to create a disinformation ad campaign coupled with accessible websites containing comprehensive online resources about disinformation. The campaign would cost an estimated $1 to $2 million per year and would run multiple targeted ads for different age groups. The government would partner with experts for design and delivery, and the campaign would include ongoing evaluation based on engagement metrics and public opinion. Next slide, please. For budgetary considerations, we propose that funds from the Digital Citizen Contribution Program, which has gained over $30 million in funding over the last 5 years, be redirected to create the National Digital Literacy Program. We also proposed a minimum of 15% from the initial $150 million allocated to CBC Radio Canada in the recent federal budget be redirected to the disinformation ad campaign and the National Digital Literacy Program. We recognize the EPA strategy involves risks such as intergovernmental cooperation, which would be mitigated by reinforcing collaborative efforts with the government. There is also a risk of the digital literacy program being unequal among provinces and territories. Federal government oversight and funding provided based on population size will help ensure identical programs. It is also possible for the ad campaigns to fail. This will be addressed by running the ads in phases with rigorous evaluation to ensure that end results match expectations. The act may cause initial public backlash. This will be alleviated with strategic communications clarifying the national security risk that disinformation poses and reinforce the motive of safeguarding the public while protecting individual freedom. By tackling disinformation, we arm individuals with tools necessary to think critically about what they see online, as false narratives on a massive scale contribute to economic instability. I invite my wonderful colleague Cameron to present our next priority. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Emma. The next priority we will examine is Canada's economic security and its impact and importance at a national level. Its importance was made clear when Prime Minister Carney stated at Davos that you cannot live with the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination. In the face of a mercantilist economic agenda from the Americans, the Canadian economy has come under threat from multiple angles. In line with mercantilism, the deployment of tariffs to onshore sectors like resource extraction and manufacturing leaves Canada's export portfolio vulnerable. 77% of Canadian exports went to the United States in 2023, with upwards of 34% of Canada's GDP coming from exports and export-related activity. A rupture in this integration puts the security of our wider economy and, frankly, the nation in danger. Complicating things further is the fact that at the helm of this new trading posture towards Canada is a president who has proven himself to be erratic and an eroding force on the post-World War II rules-based trading order. Therefore, to protect our economy from these threats, we will need to diversify our export base by leveraging our position as a stable middle power to expand our trading network and invest in our capacity to bring products to port across an East-West framework. In respect to its security importance, we will need to incorporate these goals into our proposed and modernized national security strategy through a written and defined policy agenda that paves the way towards security-minded economic modernization and diversity. Next slide, please. This leads us to Project Maple Fortress. Project Maple Fortress expands and defines Canada's ongoing global trade mission into a three-phased approach that looks to grow our trade footprint and invest heavily in our domestic capacity to bring products to market. Phase 1 of this recommendation sees the Prime Minister and Global Affairs Canada continue its current trade diversification mission. It also recommends that we shift away from cross-sector integration through broad free trade agreements and pursue limited increases in key sector integration based on template deals like our recent agreement with China. Phase 2 of our recommendation outlines long-term investment in improving our capacity to bring products to port across an East-West framework. Investment will come from the current Trade Diversification Corridors Fund, established in the 2025 federal budget, with $5 billion already appropriated over the next 7 years to carry out product support capacity investment. We recommend, however, that this fund ought to be extended to improve its impact in the long term, which is why we recommend that as current large-scale federal infrastructure projects, like the Invest in Canada plan, expire in 2028, we extend the Trade Diversification Corridors Fund in its place and adopt its 12-year timeframe, extending the program to 2040 and doubling its budget from $5 to $10 billion of investment. Lastly, Project Maple Fortress's third phase will take place in 2040, when a mandated audit of its progress will take place. The audit will examine expansion of the project's fund investment beyond 2040 and identify needed repairs to existing infrastructure built from the project. Next slide, please. Implementation of this policy requires 2 steps. In the short term, a formalized mandate letter from the Prime Minister to Global Affairs Canada and the Minister of International Trade, Maninder Sidhu, outlining our new recommended trade strategy is required. Secondly, over the next 2 years, the negotiation and passing of an act of Parliament will be required to implement phases 2 and 3 of Project Maple Fortress. Fiscally, the implementation of the project's diplomatic mission requires no new funding, as the pre-appropriated Global Affairs Canada budget will be sufficient. Funding for the expanded budget of the Trade Diversification Corridors Fund will consist of reappropriating $5 billion of freed capital from the Prime Minister's recent mandate that cabinet ministers cut 15% of their budgets. Implementation of this project also necessitates consultation with key stakeholders like Indigenous Canadians and the provinces and territories. Regarding the provinces and territories, consultation takes the form of including premiers and provincial and territorial leaders on trade missions and working with the provinces and territories to disperse new investment evenly to ensure interprovincial infrastructure develops smoothly. Risks to implementation of Project Maple Fortress consist of communication, value difference, and sustainability risks. Inconsistent reaction to Canada's new trade agreement with China and the stalled opening of the Gordie Howe Bridge highlight the importance of managing American political hostility to increase Canadian trade agency. Undertaking a strategy of preemptive communication with the Americans about trade dealings will be key to control the narrative with an unreliable partner, hopefully providing both parties a political off-ramp to claim progress. Value-based differences between Canada and new partners like China or Saudi Arabia are also a risk. Mitigating this consists of engaging in value-based realism and avoiding broad economic integration with potentially hostile partners. Final risk to consider is sustainability. We must build our new infrastructure with sustainability in mind to tackle climate and longevity concerns. This infrastructure needs to be able to withstand both changing climates and the dance with time itself. Looking beyond our economy, we cannot expand our ability to bring product support without securing what will be key global shipping routes in our Arctic, like the Northwest Passage, which brings our scope from national to global security considerations from my wonderful colleague, David. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Cameron. Canada's Arctic is 40% of our landmass and a critical security corridor, and right now, it's exposed. While adversaries invest in the North, Canada has left a huge vacuum. Today, we are presenting the Northern Shield, a phased, fiscally responsible plan to secure Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic. The threat environment has 3 convergent dimensions. Each existing surveillance gaps over the Arctic, for instance, leaves Canada exposed to significant threats. Hostile and potentially hostile states are currently acquiring northern ports, energy, and telecommunications infrastructure. On the other hand, inadequate infrastructure means Canada currently lacks the airfields, the roads, and the capacity to deploy a rapid military response in the north. Just yesterday, for instance, we intercepted 5 Russian warplanes in international and Arctic space. All of our concerns have one root cause: decades of underinvestment in Arctic presence. Next slide, please. The Northern Shield is built on 4 design principles: dual-use infrastructure, so every asset serves both a military and a civilian function; modular and scalable delivery, so the plan is scalable depending on available resources; indigenous partnerships with agreements set in place before construction even begins; and security and resilience by design, so every asset is screened for foreign interference and climate exposure before funding is approved. These are exactly how we would hold the policy accountable. The plan runs in 3 phases. Phase 1, from years 1 to 3, is where we propose legislation. The Arctic Infrastructure and Sovereignty Act, or ASAP, as we call it, would establish the Northern Shield Secretariat, which would be the governing body of the Act. This body will be made up of indigenous leaders as well as provincial, territorial, and federal representatives. We are also going to be procuring and deploying temporary surveillance immediately at this stage at strategy corridors. Phase two is going to run from years 4 to 7, and this is where we expand Arctic deep water ports for naval and civilian use. Airfields, roads, and communication networks are built or upgraded, and dual-use Arctic research stations are built to serve science in times of peace and logistics in a military context. The final phase is phase three from years 8 to 15. And here, a dedicated Arctic subdivision of the Canadian Armed Forces would be established, as well as a joint surveillance and response program launched with partners. We would also create a Northern Sovereign Wealth Fund to ensure that some revenues from these infrastructures are transferred directly to Indigenous communities. Next slide, please. The total cost is going to be 30 to 40 to $43 billion over 12 to 15 years, which admittedly is a significant amount of money. This would roughly translate to $2 to $3 billion annually. We have also designed a funding structure that specifically means that no single ministry or entity carries all of the weight. The defense budget, for instance, will fund a large portion of the plan. Canada's NATO 2% commitments already obligates this level of defense spending anyway, and this will just redirect an existing obligation towards a clear gap while providing direct economic advantages as well. Also, the dual-use nature of this plan would qualify it for federal infrastructure plans, meaning that ministries and agencies like Transport, Innovation, and Northern Affairs will finance portions of the plan. The other consideration here as well is America's strategic interest in the Arctic. Given our binational mutual defense agreements, NORAD, which has been active since 1957, the United States contributes to shared surveillance infrastructure in the region. Finally, ports and energy infrastructure are opened to private partnerships. These private investments will demonstrate commercial viability while reducing significant public expenditure. With these, we have a funding model where the federal government is not just writing a single check for $43 billion, but contributions are shared amongst commitments, infrastructure programs, allies, and private capital. But here's the thing, like everything else we've shared today, there were a few risks that we anticipate and we plan for. Cost overruns, for instance, will be controlled through mandatory independent audits before each phase unlocks, and Indigenous partnerships will be protected by legally binding agreements before any construction even begins. This is our Northern Shield, our structured, cost-effective, fiscally responsible plan to protect our Arctic. And now I will pass on to my phenomenal colleague Emma to present our recommended next steps and conclude. Next slide, please.
Thank you, David. Our next steps begin with organizing a First Minister's meeting with relevant offices to strategically communicate policy proposals outlined in our disinformation priority. Second is to continue diversifying current trade partners and initiate negotiations to broaden the scope of the Trade Diversification Corridors Fund. Third is to consult relevant stakeholders to strategically communicate our Arctic policy proposal. Then prepare and submit a detailed proposal to Parliament to initiate formal legislative proceedings. Next slide, please. In conclusion, Stronger Together, our proposed strategy addresses national security risks at an individual level through tackling disinformation, a national level through strengthening our economy, and at a global level by defending our sovereign Arctic space. This strategy creates an overarching plan of action to safeguard Canadians in a new world where the definition of national security has drastically changed. With that, we thank you for your time, and we now welcome any questions.
Thank you so much. It's obvious you did a lot of work here, and it's very interesting to see how well you collaborated across all your areas and how diverse your solutions are, and quite comprehensive. It's always wonderful to see groups participate in such an effective way, and we're very, very thankful that you've participated today. So a big kudos out to you. I'm gonna pass the first question over to my colleague Christina, who has quite a bit of expertise in communications and public engagement.
Apologies for that. Thank you very much. So great presentation. Really curious. How did you consider different stakeholders' perspectives on each of the various recommendations you have, what interventions they may make, whether it be business, not just federal, provincial, or indigenous groups, but other stakeholder groups outside of it in designing your plan? And then now that you've wrapped up the whole plan, what would be the communication strategy to roll it out as a whole?
Thank you so much for your question. I can take that. In terms of our stakeholdership, we made sure to focus on stakeholders within the purview and responsibility of those delegated to the federal government through different acts of parliament and the Constitution. So when thinking of our Indigenous stakeholders, we made sure to uphold the right to consultation in each one of our plans. And we also looked at the penumbra of how the federal government interacts with different elements of Canadian society through different acts of parliament and different functions of the federal government. That's the provinces and territories and municipalities. We also looked at the individual unit. So everyday Canadians, irregardless of province, municipality, or status, we had to make sure that anyone who is affected by the federal government is consulted and looked at in terms of our implementation approach. In terms of a communication strategy, we will first hold a First Minister's meeting to discuss how to put this out to the general public. We will also send a copy to press and allies ahead of a public release to ensure that they're ahead on the decision curve. And we will lastly go full hands on deck for a public messaging campaign through our federal channels and through the media. Thank you so much for your question.
Any follow-up at all, Christina? Wonderful. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Craig. Lots of expertise in interprovincial and international affairs.
Great. Thank you, Noah. And thanks to the team for the thoughtful presentation. Great innovative name on the economic side of the project, Maple Fortress, which I thought was quite creative. My question is around the involvement of provinces and territories along with the private sector, and specifically how to identify infrastructure needs as you're looking to ultimately diversify trade and strengthen internal trade. How you're envisioning that would work. I see in terms of your implementation plan, you've got that First Minister's meeting, but that seems to be an after the fact in terms of, you know, announcing the strategy overall. But there is a part of building this that requires input from partners, but specifically when it comes to certain proposals, such as identifying infrastructure needs, what's the role of partners in doing that?
Thank you so much for your question. I will pass it to my colleague David to discuss an answer to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron. So our infrastructure need, like mentioned earlier, it's a huge span of enormous assets, but it would be identified first through strategic threat mapping. So we are going to identify for all of the plans which which of the infrastructure has a significant threat, significant surveillance threat, significant disinformation threats. And that'll be the first way that we identify through through mapping the threat levels. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to audit our current infrastructure plan. So we're going to go through all of the infrastructures that we have for disinformation, educating and advertising. So what infrastructures do we have? What agencies are within our control? With Transport Canada, with Crown Indigenous relationship, with our current access space, what is the what are we're going to audit it, and we're going to we're going to pick the ones that require an upgrade, the one that requires complete starting from scratch, and that'll be the first way to know. But the other thing we're also going to do is go through climate and environmental screening for all of our options that we've chosen. So we have to make sure we have to prioritize the national interest for options, but also making sure that they are that they are resilient to the climate space that they exist, both with the climate and with the environment as well. I'm sorry, with the economy as well, making sure that we're prioritizing the resilience of those infrastructure in terms of its response to the economy. And the other thing that we're going to be doing here, specifically for the Arctic space, is making sure prioritizing that every single infrastructure investment that happens is, is gonna serve a dual use function. So it's gonna be very important for military and protection strategy, but also very important for community building and economic strategies as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any follow-up at all, Craig?
Not on my side. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to pass it to my colleague Kimberly with lots of expertise in cyber and information and issues around and disinformation.
Great, thanks, Noah. A couple of questions maybe for you. On the disinformation portion of your plan, the educate, protect, and the education portion is really heavily reliant on the cooperation of provinces, territories, but also of municipal school boards to actually implement the education portion. And I think I can foresee a world where that is implemented unevenly across the country. Have you thought about how you would prevent the creation or manage the creation of perhaps I don't know, cyber resilience gaps, for lack of a better word, as a result of that uneven implementation? That's my first question. My second, on the Digital Services Act, you talk about a watermark on all AI-generated content. I'm wondering how you anticipate ensuring foreign compliance, if you even can, and then if you can't, how are you going to manage complaints from foreigners that maybe they'll pull out, maybe they will just say it's overreach, in extraterritorial overreach by the government of Canada. Just curious how you anticipate obtaining foreign compliance on that piece. And then I think I have two more questions, if I can, on NORAD cost sharing. There has often been NORAD cost sharing, but I think we're in a very different dynamic with the US, and I don't think we can take for given that they will actually cost share anything being built in Canadian territory. But my question really is, do we even want them to? Do we want them to invest in assets that are for surveillance and reconnaissance in Canadian territory, or do we actually want those now in these days to be sovereign? And when you say sharing with allies a copy of the strategy before you release it, do allies include the US anymore or not?
Thank you for your questions. I will pass the first question regarding municipal disparities to my colleague Rashad. I will then pass the second question regarding watermarks of AI content to my colleague Emma, and then I will pass your final question around NORAD to my colleague David. So first, Rashad, he will answer your first question. Thank you very much.
Yes, so to answer your first question about working with the provinces and the municipalities, especially when it comes to boards, as that is, I believe, a municipal responsibility. So of course, like we as the federal government, we will respect the jurisdiction of the provinces, just because when it comes to education, we don't want to create more tension with other provincial and municipal government institutions. And so the idea behind us primarily just funding and like creating a strategy, we want to give this full power, or I shouldn't say power, but most of the steering power to the province and municipalities, just because they are much more knowledgeable about local issues, especially when it comes to disinformation. Although yes, Canadians may suffer that nationally, the type of disinformation that certain cities might vary from city to city. And so we will rely on the expertise of provinces, municipalities, as well as local organizations to address that gap, because primarily we as a government just want to make sure that progress is being made. But in terms of like implementing a curriculum and strategy, we would give majority of that ownership and responsibility and power to other government entities other than the federal government. And so in doing so, we hope to not create too much tension between the federal government and other institutions.
To answer your second question, to help mitigate foreign companies pulling out, like Meta, for example, a time frame would be enacted, for example, 1 year, to allow these social media platform companies to reintroduce that fact checking and essentially gear up to comply with this act. Once that time frame is up, then fines would be introduced, for example, 1 month, 2 months, 3 on, and so forth. Really, that time frame is allowing these companies to invest in whatever they need to comply with that act. Thank you.
And I'm just going to quickly answer your last question about NORAD cost sharing. It's an important point that you raise here. I mean, American and Canadian airspace is strategically inseparable. It's impossible to separate. The airspace is Canada, and the Arctic space is essentially in Americans' backyard. Something else that I think is important to consider is the fact that just yesterday, the Americans, or NORAD, essentially intercepted 5 Russian planes in the Arctic and international space. So it is just as important to us as it is to them. And it's a consistent process, and they have nothing. There is no indication right now that cost would be divided. And there was no indication that the U.S. would stop sharing those funds just because of the inseparable nature of our airspaces, both in the civilian reasoning and the military one.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stop it here because we are past time. Thank you very much.